Our third and last presentation this evening features the work of Hubert Pelletier and Yves de Fontenay. Pelletier de Fontenay was established in Montreal, Canada in 2010 after both partners worked in architecture offices in Canada and the United States, as well as in the fields of industrial design and fine art. Hubert Pelletier studied industrial design at the University of Montreal and at the ENSCI in Paris. He received his Master and Bachelor of Architecture degrees from the University of Montreal. Yves de Fontenay studied at the Federal Polytechnic School of Lausanne and received his Master and Bachelor of Architecture degrees from the University of Montreal as well. Both Hubert and Yves currently teach at the University of Montreal and the McGill School of Architecture in Canada. In their submission, they wrote that they were interested in which ideas in architecture transcend time, and described a process of looking at past architectural models and studying which forms, structures, and organizations recur throughout time. It is these invariants, as they call them, which they perceive as permanent. We welcome Hubert and Yves.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. As you mentioned, I'm Yves de Fontenay.
Hubert Pelletier.
It's really a privilege to be among this year's League Prize winners this year. We'd obviously like to thank the Architectural League especially, and Matt and Martha for organizing the exhibition. Also, we'd also like to thank the jury for selecting us. We'd especially like to thank also the Quebec Arts Council, who helped us kickstart this project that we're going to be showing. And finally, also a special thanks to all the friends and the staff, especially Yann Guécrosier and Nicolas Muche, who helped us with this project over the last 4 or 5 years. I'll let Hubert start with the presentation.
Yeah, so tonight we will try to address the theme of permanence and impermanence in our work, but also since this prize is for emerging architects, we thought it would be interesting to also speak about emergence and how we dealt with the condition of beginning as an architect. We will present a research project very important to us called Invariants that started all the way back in 2010 and that spanned the entire 5-6 years now that since we've established Pelletier de Fontenay. So up to now, this project was a kind of work in progress that ran more or less in parallel to our more traditional client-based practice. But the application to the League Prize forced us to examine both strands of our practice under the same theme, permanence and impermanence, and which is something that we have never really examined before because we always thought that this was more like a research exercise and we're running the practice in parallel. So, emergence. This is a picture from 1966 taken in Rome. And there we see a young Richard Serra, 27 years old, in his zoo period. And at this time, he was experimenting with a bunch of things in material, and among them, live and stuffed animal. So we think this image is very interesting because it represents this uncertainty about one's work and where it's going to lead. And while some pieces of the same period, such as doors and through pieces, look very prescient now that we know what he's doing in regard of his actual production, Live Pig Cage 1 is definitely an aborted strand of his work, very far from what his practice would eventually become. So this image of Richard Serra feeding a pig embodies for us, on one end, this state of confusion and uncertainty about that is typical of young creatives and about what they are hoping to do in their fields. And on the other end, we find it very inspiring. We find inspiring this willingness to experiment and potentially fail, obviously, before finding your own way into creation. And to us, it represents, in a way, where we were back in 2010, where to start. And the answer really was anywhere, because in the end, you just need to get started. So shortly after this is Rome exhibition, Serra wrote down his seminal verb list, a list of actions to be performed on different materials. Quote, I wanted to enact the verb without thinking, in relation to material without thinking about their ends or their conclusions, without having to define them in terms of art, but to involve myself in a process of making. And this is really a phrase that stuck to us, involve ourselves in the process of making. And Serra gave himself an experimental program, a repetitive exercise to get things going and actually have something on the table to reflect on. Having the confidence that the process will lead him somewhere he can't foresee a priori. So, to cut, to prop, to lift, to splash, to roll. I would buy a sheet of lead, unroll it, and roll it back up. Now, for anybody coming in, it could have looked nonsensical, but at some point, if you want to get down to zero, you have to start from scratch. This is Richard Serra saying this. So back in 2010, we were in the same position, starting from scratch, really standing on the clean slate. We had just had left our job, we had no clients, no projects, no teaching position. I'm sure a lot of you were in the same position at some point. But we needed to work on a project that would get us going.
Right. So really having no clear idea of what our architecture would really be about. And it felt impossible for us to clarify this in a theoretical manner. And so we felt it was really important to act first and then reflect upon what we did in a make-think feedback loop. So we thought we needed an exploration program much like Serra's verb list, only on one hand, we needed to do this project definitely we needed to do this project differently than the way we did things in school. Our school experience and our training in school was almost always about a fictional context, working with fictional sites, fictional narratives, fictional programs. So on the other hand, though, we really want to start from scratch. If we really wanted to start from scratch, we needed to get down to the zeros that Serra was talking about earlier. So we need to strip the architecture from all its complexity, from all the politics, from all the variables, to bring it down to the basic, really a simplified condition. So this idea triggered a series of interesting questions. What happens when you remove everything that's contextual in architecture? Is there anything left? When you remove all the variables from the architectural project, again, no site, no program, no client, no narrative, no budget, no regulations, no social context, no political climate, is there anything left to hold on to? Can architecture still operate without any external factors, with only its internal coherence? Can it operate only from within? So we stripped down the architectural project from the aspects that vary, and we made a list of constant things that constantly exist, that always exist regardless of the project conditions. So we ended up isolating the following 5 parameters: form, structure, movement, proportion, and light. And we thought that these 5 criteria are really what separate an architectural exploration from a merely formal or sculptural exploration. We ended up calling these constants the invariants of the architectural project, hence the title of the research project, Invariations. So really, summing it up in a sentence, here was our program. We needed to generate hollow forms that would credibly hold up against gravity, be penetrated by light, and in which one's body could move and relate proportionally. So, the question was, how do we shape the invariants? We came back to the idea of process as a way to generate something out of nothing, something that we cannot necessarily foresee. And in our case, instead of using verbs, we relied mostly on geometric operations. I'll explain here 2 examples of these operational sequences. Invariation 1 is the first prototype that emerged out of our explorations. So we would start with basic 2D geometries, lines, grids, or sets of points. And the geometry itself was not really important. It was really more of a point of departure for testing ideas. In this case, what we were interested in was the idea of randomness. And so we started by placing a series of points randomly within a square. We then drew a triangular grid by linking all the random points within the square. A second denser pattern was drawn by subdividing each initial triangle in 3 smaller triangles within it. The first set of points was connected by a series of arches, columns and arches, all of which had the same base point and the same apex. And we then extruded each arch perpendicularly, and the intersection lines corresponded directly with the second subdivided triangular grid. So the result is this complex series of intersecting vaults. Every single vault is different from one another. So we had this idea at the beginning that the geometric process was going to be a really objective and rigorous thing, but we progressively realized that we were constantly mapping and projecting our own architectural ideas onto these abstract geometries. And that was really the only way to make it move forward, the only way to make a decision about the next step to be taken. So in this case, the classical form of the vault came to us because we thought it'd be interesting to oppose it to that idea of randomness. So this duality is really what drove this prototype forward, trying to find a coherent balance between both those ideas, the grid or the vault and the random grid. So here we see a plan view of what this prototype gave. An elevation view and an axometric view. So I'm just going to present a second invariation or operational sequence. So this is invariation 2, the second prototype we developed. So we first drew a lattice that was drawn with 2 misaligned patterns. We then defined rectangles anchored on intersection points of the grid, so 4 rectangles. So at some point we would move from 2D to 3D, and we would continue to complexify the model and make it evolve. A first series of rectangular bars were extruded along the rectangles we first drew, and then a second series of rectangular bars was extruded over the first series of bars along the second grid that we drew. So the multiple points of intersection between these 2 layers link the bars that were previously separated by voids together. And in this case, and we automatically read the opportunity to link these very abstract geometries. And in this case, we were fascinating with the idea of separate yet interconnected volumes and this idea of this 3-dimensional lattice. So the resulting weave allowed for multiple paths to be used to travel through the space. It created an interconnected system. And the last step was to make various openings at different intersecting faces to bring light into the system. So of course, the sequences we're showing you now are, like Niraj said earlier, post-rationalized versions of the actual process that we made after the prototypes were fully developed. I mean, the reality was obviously extremely chaotic and a lot more messy with numerous back and forth discussions, sketches, and study models. So here's the plan of that prototype, the elevation, and the axometric view.
So Yves just presented an overview of the iterative process for the first 2 invariations. But over the course of the last 6 years, we went through these manipulations for tens of different versions. Most of them abandoned, like it's always the case in any creative process. But in the end, we developed 9 different models that we felt brought together all the 5 invariants in a coherent whole, and that we felt were worth the effort of bringing all the way up to their conclusions. So I'll quickly present each of them in the chronological order that they were designed, but really like a quick survey of all of them. So invariation 1. So as we discussed earlier, invariation 1 was about the encounter of a classical form with a random organization. And of course, the vault is supercharged with historical, symbolical, and affective meanings. But in the context of this exercise, we were taking a step back, looking at it from a distance and using it for its specific formal, spatial, and structural aspects. It doesn't mean that we're not interested into the history of it, but that in this case, it was really more a spatial device. In variation 2, the subject was the weaving of the external and internal space and the creation of a spatial sequence where you have to go up and down to move around the space. And again, like with the vault, the kind of figure of the pitched roof was sort of imposed itself in a way to go from the abstraction of geometry to make this geometry enter the realm of architecture. And since we were not operating in a context or in a urban context, we only the history of architecture and the history of form and this kind of réservoir imaginaire of form to kind of go forward in this process. In variation 3, and we were exploring in this model the idea of the structural skin and how the pentagonal shape could be used to explore the question of depth of the structure and the corner conditions. We looked at the paradox of the delamination of the structure, creating this kind of in-between vertical space in the stacked system. In variation 4, based on the cellular plan, this model was about exploring the enfilade as a spatial sequence. Each cell is connected to the other directly without spaces specifically used for circulation. And the geometry created this opportunity to create openings in the roof triangulation that we created in order to bring bounce light from the adjacent roof. And we see this kind of spatial layering that the cellular component was creating as an opportunity, a design opportunity. In variation 5, this was about an in-between condition oscillation between two identities, the barrel vault and the mushroom column and slab system. And both conditions are produced by the same geometric operation, which was cutting vaulted shape out of the solid block from two different angles. And when we were selecting where we would stop these extrusion, it would produce basically either a barrel vault that would be continuous with a continuous wall, or a column that was just the slice of matter left in place as the structure. Here we see both conditions. And these, of course, these beautiful kind of lines into space, this kind of landscape of intersecting lines in the ceiling scape. In variation 6, there we were exploring the idea of the cantilever with the very minimal vertical support. And the shifting slabs are superimposing in the center, closer to the columns, offering a thickening of the structure that was allowing the structural feet. And the ribbing of the slab is both what makes the structure hold up and the organization of space, because we organize them in a kind of pinwheel fashion, and with the receding planes, they were creating all these kind of sub-organization in the slab and therefore in the space because they were so strong. In variation 7, much like in variation 5, this is an exploration on an ambiguous condition between, this time, domes and columns. Domes are carved out of a solid block with very little material left, creating more of a lineament, a linear structure than an actual domed space. But still, from close-up, you can kind of recompose the dome figure from the lines into space. In variation 8, the question for this one was how to generate a circular plan while avoiding the regular radial structure. By putting the same number of posts inside and outside the figure, we had to at some point merge structural points and propose a new kind of shifted beams organization. And the structure resulting is what gives this kind of dynamic expression to an otherwise very stable basic form, very basic condition. In variation 9, the last one, exploring the idea of the clear span building. So 3 parallel grids are superimposed in a way that define intersection points that are used for the vertical support at the periphery. So the dense structure filters light, it actually becomes the kind of ornamental background of the space. So when we thought about this year's theme's impermanence, we quickly understood what mattered the most to us was the permanence of idea. We've become more and more fascinated with the recurrence of certain forms, structure, or organization through time. And so we tried to understand which structuring concept and archetype shaped our work and which one kept re-emerging, consciously or not, in both our research and our projects. And so we did a kind of introspective exercise of trying to group projects in teams, projects that share common ideas and transcend times.
Like Hubert said, we did this kind of introspective exercise where we wanted to look through all our work so far, both the research work and the client-based work, and find these common themes, find these common ideas that can be really, that are common ideas that we've seen throughout history. So here's what we came up with, and you'll see we're going to be going really fast through these projects without kind of going into the details, because we really just want to illustrate the reoccurrence of those concepts. So it's kind of like speed dating through our portfolio. So the first concept that we noticed kept reappearing is the inner void. So just even in the invariations, we used it in 3 of the different models, the prototypes. So obviously it's a spatial model that's been around forever. Examples like the Roman Insula or even the Renaissance Palazzo. So in this prototype, the radial concentric nature of the geometry we were exploring almost naturally imposed the idea of the inner void. And often that's what happened in the prototypes of the Invariations project. But in our client-based work, we noticed it also reoccurring a lot. So I'm really quickly going to go through a few office projects that worked with this concept. This first one is a campus project for an office campus project. It's in an industrial area in Montreal, and here we use the inner void as a way to break down the different office programs into separate buildings, but to reconnect them within the central inner courtyard. And because of the context, the urban context, this was a tool to really just isolate and kind of introvert the project and create a distance between this industrial part of the city and this kind of office island project. Here we just see an axiometric view, perspective view of the inner courtyard. Again, in this second project, it's a competition project for an opera house in Busan, Korea. The program called for 3 separate performance halls, a small one, a medium one, and a large one. And our answer was to link these halls from below and from above the ground plane while keeping a central common open courtyard. So we show that in the diagram. So the openings to this courtyard corresponded with different access paths from the sites, the surrounding site. And here we see an axiometric view. Third project, a residential master plan where we use the inner void as a way to circulate through the blocks along an internal balcony system. Oops, sorry. This is for a private house where the void was formed by connecting 4 different rooms in an enfilade sequence, eliminating all the corridors. And it was all based around this square courtyard. And so the courtyard became kind of a buffer space between the rooms. The square angle, the square shape created these rapprochements, these narrowings between the rooms to organize the space. But again, you know, the courtyard and the inner void is central to the concept. Another project, I think this is the last one with the inner voids. And this project is for a lighthouse on the site of the Costa Concordia wreckage in Italy. And the central void was used here as a symbol of the loss that happened at that specific location. And so we started with just the simple diagram, the ring. And that ring shape naturally lent itself to the idea of a circular central staircase. And so we use this double helix staircase running along the interior perimeter of the structure so that visitors would naturally circulate up and then gradually down the structure. So the helix-shaped staircase in a way resembled a water vortex, and which is another strong symbol for the site. So the inherent qualities in that geometry and in the movement of the helix form present in that staircase is what then drove the form of the rest of the structure, which you'll see later in another family. So this is the second family, the shed or pitched roof. So it's this archetypal form that kept reappearing in our work again. This form obviously refers to the origins of architecture, in part because of its inherent and just structural and functional qualities. So to the invariants that you just saw. So in the house we showed you earlier, Ouroboros house, each one of the rooms, each one of the 4 volumes has a distinct shed-like profile that all connect to one another in that central rectangular courtyard. Another view of the house. In this project, for a glass pavilion at Montreal Botanical Garden, the shed form is used as a mechanism to control light and the views inside the space. Here, the shed form, it echoes more the industrial shed than the typical architectural house shed. And what's particular in this project is that we use the pleated geometry of the shed that we would commonly see for different industrial, train yards, for example, but not only on the roof, but also on the facades on 2 of the sides of the building. We'll come back to it in another family. So finally, a third project for a beach in a suburban neighborhood in Montreal, just outside Montreal. So all the homes, this is a typical kind of North American suburban area where all the homes in the area were mostly 60s constructions with very low-pitched roofs. So we reuse that form and that geometry both for the floating pavilion and the different docks that were adjacent. So the project was to bring the visitors out into the river and outside of the beach to look back kind of at the city. And in the summer it would open up, and in the winter it would close itself. Fourth family. The third grouping, is structure, but here it's the idea of bared down expression of structure where the exposed structural elements actually make the space and organize the space in certain cases. So again, in 3 of the invariations, strong presence of this exposed structures. They all heavily rely on structure to define and contain the space. So this is our second project we ever did, was a competition for the Holocaust, for a Holocaust memorial at Atlantic City. And the structure is used here to express the immense weight of the losses that occurred during the Holocaust. And so the thinning concrete columns, concrete beams that sit above these reflective glass walls and allow us to see the sky once inside the pavilion. Versus when we're outside of the pavilion, it just looks like a heavy mass. Here in a apartment renovation, where we see we use the structuring, the supporting structure that we use to support the upper floors, and we left it exposed and even highlighted it just to actually organize the space. And it's really what organized the different living areas between, or divided the different living areas. Again, the Concordia Lighthouse, where the structure is really used as a singular, all-encompassing element. You know, there's essentially nothing else present, only that structure. And again, the glass pavilion, in which we, like I said before, expose the structure to shape the facades and the space inside the entire skin of the building. And here, like I said, the structure becomes kind of a tool to control the light and the views outside towards the garden. It's kind of like stripping down layers, bringing it back to its almost most basic condition. And finally, the last family is vaults and domes that we identified. Obviously, the reoccurrence of the vault and the dome in the Invariants project again. So even if we weren't aiming at the beginning of the research project to work with vaults, the form sort of sneaked in on the process as a strong geometry, because it was charged with both this formal complexity, but also this evocative power. So as Hubert explained earlier, we were mostly interested in seeing how we could confront these classical geometries with less rigid grids and free them from their, let's say, more traditional regularity. And so after the first prototype, we continued to play with these forms, this time more deliberately. And Variation 5 is exploring more of the barrel vault and column aspect, like Hubert mentioned. And Variation 7 is more the explanation of the classic dome. And lastly, the strange thing is that even if we were interested in exploring these classical geometries, we never planned on using them or seeing them appear in our own work or in our own practice. But the dome, the purest form of the dome, reappeared recently in one of our projects, the Insectarium project in Montreal, which we're currently working on. So it's an insect museum that has both live insects and a series of perceptual spaces and this huge collection. So in this case, we use the dome in a very special moment in the museum experience, where the visitors get to see this immense insect collection. And we felt, you know, it deserved this moment deserved this singular, powerful space. And what's funny in this project is the dome is used in complete opposition with the rest of the building, which is almost entirely underground or made up of production greenhouses for plants and insects. We'll let Hubert finish off.
Yeah, so these direct links between research and practice were never fully anticipated from the beginning. Invariation was always thought as an exercise running in parallel, not so different from the nice 9-square grid exercise John Eshdock was giving the students at Cooper Union. We always saw it as a form of training, like going to the gym, practicing scales. And Variation was about exploring autonomy in architecture, and this is actually very much in contrast with our actual client-based practice, which is so heavily contextually driven. And this contrast is fundamental because to us the ideal outcome is when a project is simultaneously capable of fulfilling the program and improving the context while remaining coherent as an autonomous object. Thanks.